Now, this next set of action potentials here. Oh, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. I bet I could pass without needing to know this. I bet I can even get a 90 without needing to know this. And the answer is you can. But you're not here to just pass. You're here to kick ass. You're not here to pass. You're here to excel. These courses long ago ceased to be merely remedial. These courses long ago became excellence tools. So I'll tell you what, let's do a little Conrad Fisher intellectual Lamaze. Little intellectual Lamaze, don't go. I have regular Lamaze classes, you know those, right? 3-breath Lamaze, Fisher method. Ready? Ready? Can I have the epidural? 3-breath Conrad Fisher Lamaze class. Can I have the epidural, please? Okay. So the thing is that you can make a little thing here where it's actually it's a little. It's okay. Now, remember that the membrane potential. This is saying that the inner part of the membrane, the inside of the cell, is mostly negative, or the inside of the cell is mostly positive. The inside of the cell is normally negative. What creates that? Potassium. Coming in or coming out? Potassium going in or going out? Out. Because normally potassium goes out in those ungated channels. The positive thing leaving makes it negative inside. All the happy people left this party. There's nothing in there but a bunch of negative people. All the happy, positive people left. And there's nothing in there but a bunch of sad sacks. Now, what happens first to drive this action potential up into the positive zone? Well, it's normally negative inside here. How does it suddenly become positive? Sodium suddenly rushes in. Look, it starts at negative. If something positive goes in, it becomes positive. Yeah. And it's fast. Look how fast that is. Look how sharp. Look how sharp up that is. So it must be fast. And it's fast. Bing! Sodium goes in. Bing! And then it stops. Sodium goes in. Boing! And then it stops. And when it stops, that's why this action potential takes a little dip down. When it stops, that's why the action potential takes a little dip down. When it stops, it takes a little dip down because the fast sodium channels stopped putting sodium in the cell. Well, why doesn't it stay constant then? You stopped entering. How come it went down? We stopped entering. How come it went down? Because there's still potassium leaving. The sodium stopped entering. How come it went down? How come it started to become negative again? Because potassium is still leaving. Sodium goes in, becomes positive inside, stops. But potassium is still leaving. So it starts to become negative again. That's a little dip down. Well, how come it stops becoming negative? Because this is going to be the only thing that's different from what we said before. Look, this action potential is the same as the other one. It's the same thing as the last chapter, except one point. There's only one thing different from the other one. Calcium. Why you gotta make it so smart like that? You gotta make it out like it's such a big deal, huh? It's only one thing different. You make it out like I can't understand nothing. And the answer is there's only one difference. Before, in the other action potentials, the sodium goes in, the sodium stops going in, then the potassium goes out. Bing, 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 bing. Here it's exactly the same. Why does it plateau? Because calcium starts to go into the cell. slow. Let's all do this. Ready? That's how we feel when we look at action potential. The L channels. The L, the long calcium channels makes me feel like this, like a loser. Okay, so the thing is that the L type calcium channels. The calcium channels, that's what this phase 2 is. It's calcium going in. And because the calcium goes in and calcium is positive, instead of the action potential going back down to becoming negative, it stays up plateauing positive. It stays plateauing positive because the positive calciums are going in. It can't become negative because the positive calciums are going in, so it plateaus. Why doesn't it become negative? The potassiums are leaving, the positive potassiums are leaving. Why doesn't it become negative? Because the positive potassiums are leaving, but positive calciums are going in. But there's more potassium leaving. Yeah, but there's double positive calcium. So that high amount of positive potassium leaves, but double positive calcium is going in. So it keeps it constant. That's the plateau. If it wasn't for those L-type calcium channels with the calcium going in, you would have an action potential in the heart like this. Millisecond. Bing! Yeah, and like, how's my ventricle supposed to empty? It's like, hey, SA node, how am I supposed to work like this under these conditions? Such a fast thing, huh? I think, excuse me, I need more time for my action potential. You with your like, bing, fast action potential, what am I supposed to do with that? You know what I mean? Some of us need more time than you. You know what I mean? Okay, so can you make this action potential last a little longer so some of us can, you know, you might be able to pong like that, but the rest of us have a little calcium going in. Take it slow. Ay, suave. Ay, calma. Ay, tranquilo. Ay, tranquilo, hombre. Suave, papito. Give us a little time here to eject like we need to. That's what the inward calcium channels are. They're to allow you the time you need to have the blood for your heart. Yes, for your heart. Because remember, you need that plateau for a much slower action potential in order to allow the heart time to empty. I hope that that sounds repetitious. If you saw the last section and that doesn't sound repetitious, ooh, Cruz Jacob. Okay. Because the calcium is going in, that's what the plateau phase is about. Calcium is going in, that's what the plateau phase is about. The potassiums are leaving, but the calciums are going in. Potassiums are leaving, but the calciums are going in plateau. Then the calcium channels shut off. You notice when the calcium channels shut off, the thing starts becoming completely negative again. When the calcium channels shut off, all you have is potassiums leaving. When the calcium channels shut off, all you have is potassiums leaving. The positive charge potassium leaves, positive charge leaves, interior becomes negative. Positive charge potassium leaves, interior becomes negative, please. Positive charge potassium leaves, interior becomes a negative, please. And the L-type channels are L because they're long. Take a long time. Okay? Next one, phase 0. No, I can't say it. Phase 0, phase 1. I can't take it. No, please don't make me learn this. I can't stand it. I hate action potential. No, it's the same thing I just said. But let's put phase 1, phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, just to torture you. Okay, the first thing is remember that it starts out with the action potential is minus 70. Now, ready? For those of you who got it on the first time, skip the section. If you didn't get it, I'm going to say the same thing, but we're going to do it with the text. And your notes for things that are very difficult, the reason it's here twice is because the note sets for things that are very difficult for people are going to have it in pictures and cartoons and drawings, and then they're going to have it in text. But you know what it is that once you understand this action potential stuff, it's never going to change. You're not going to have to relearn it next year. It's not like you're going to have to learn the action potentials of Australian donkeys next week, and it's different. It's the same. Basically, pretty much all the life forms on the planet that have depolarization depolarize in the same way. And hearts that have automaticity, which is most hearts and most mammalian hearts, function the same way. They function the same way. So therefore, that's why you get affection from your doggy and your cat. That's why your cat loves you, because he has the same sort of heart thing. The cat has automaticity too. That's why the cat loves you. Okay? Feels the same thing. Okay? So, there it is. Look at that. Dr. Fisher put cat love into the picture. It's true, because it's not going to be different. Now, that means it's worth the energy investiture. Also, let me make a point here. Ready? These action potential phases are important because in order to be able to develop new drugs, new conquests, new investigations, you have to understand all the old ordinary knowledge that we've already accumulated for the last 100 years. Because Einthoven got the 1908 Nobel Prize. So the thing is that we just passed 100 years for Einthoven. So, you have to master all the old knowledge. You don't have to master all the methods. When Einthoven developed the EKG, in order to get the thin filaments that he needed for electrical conduction, there was no wire in existence that would allow the conduction. There was no wire thin enough to pick it up. He used quartz threads. Quartz is a crystal, dude. How do you get a thread? Einthoven, in order to check these things in cardiac conduction, Einthoven, it goes to show you, if a person's really got something that they love and are glued to, they'll find their way. They'll find their way. That's like, don't ask me how, do it. Einthoven took an arrow and heated up quartz crystals just to the melting point. And in order to get the thin filaments he needed for cardiac conduction, he heated up the quartz crystals just to the point where they melted, and then took the arrow, shot it across the room with the liquidy, melty quartz at the back end of the arrow. And when he shot the quartz across the room on the melty quartz, it created a filament so thin it could barely be seen, right? My heart is so small. How can this great love be inside me? Look at your eyes. They are small, but they see enormous things, right? Said the Sufis, right? Rumi. So he took this filament, went bing, with an arrow with melty quartz. And that was how the first EKG was developed. Now, you have to master that old sort of knowledge, not the methods, but this thing about these phases, because let's work backwards. What's the most common cause of death in the United States? It's myocardial infarction. What's the most common cause of death right after myocardial infarction? Arrhythmia. Now, when I was a resident in the 80s, people go like this, 80s or 90s. They went like this, they go, well, why wait for people to die of arrhythmias? We know you die of arrhythmia. We figured out this action potential. We're going to put everybody on enconide, flecainide, toconide, mexiletine, propafenone. We're going to put them on antiarrhythmics, and we're going to prevent those arrhythmias. And they're going to prevent them, and they're not going to die. And that's the concept of the randomized prospective trial. And basically what they did is they took thousands of people, and they put half of them on an arrhythmic, on a drug, an antiarrhythmic drug, and they put half of them on placebo. And they did a randomized, prospective, placebo-controlled trial to work with the conduction cycles that are in this section, phase 0, phase 1, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, we're not going to let people die of an arrhythmia post-MI. Put them on an antiarrhythmic right away. And I remember I came into my internship and they told us about this study, and the cardiologist was so proud that they were leading the way here in Manhattan on this trial. And by the middle of my second year of residency, the cardiologists were coming in through the basement hiding because they'd found out that the people in the placebo-controlled arm were living longer than the people on the drug. The drug was killing people. Because they took these ideas and had a problem. And the problem is that the antiarrhythmics are also proarrhythmic. And we found that the placebo-controlled arm had a higher survival than the drug arm. Now, it's good that that was the randomized prospective trial to be able to test it, proof of ideas. What's the difference between us and all the other sort of new agey people or the difference between us and politicians, because we have to study and show some evidence. But the misunderstanding of this action potential led to people being killed because we tried to prevent those arrhythmias. Okay, so now we don't give antiarrhythmics. In the 70s, when lidocaine was around, we said, why let all these people post-MI die of arrhythmias? Put everybody post-MI on lidocaine, which works on these channels. Oops! It was pro-arrhythmic and antiarrhythmic. It didn't provide any benefit. Another killer. So, what is the most common reason for being admitted to the hospital in the United States of America? An exacerbation of congestive heart failure. Does anybody know how you die of congestive failure? A weak heart? Do you drown? Do you explode? Do you dry up like a raisin in the sun? What happens to a heart deferred? Does it melt like a sickly sweet? Right? Langston Hughes, right? Does it explode? Well, it turns out that most people who die of congestive failure are not going to drown to death. They die in the middle of the night at home of sudden death with arrhythmias. Arrhythmia. And of all of the drugs that prevent those arrhythmias, the only one that lowers mortality is, big question, beta blockers, which works on these pathways. From the beginning, from the 1950s, for the next 50 years, we studied dozens of antiarrhythmics to manipulate these phases in the cardiac cycle. And with the exception of beta blockers, we have not found that any of them decrease mortality. Flecainide, enconide, propafenone, mexiletine, ibutylide, dofetilide, disopyramide, quinidine. 50 years. So what do we have now? We put in implantable defibrillators because we have not developed the drug to solve this problem. So that means you, my little pipsqueak second-year medical student, which is what step one is geared towards, or other person retraining, we have generations of decades of physicians with more experience and more knowledge than you who did not solve this problem, did they? So maybe there is no one else but you to solve the problem of antiarrhythmics. Because right now, those questions about ibutylide, dofetilide, quinidine, mexiletine, propafenone, enconide, flecainide, lidocaine, amiodarone, disopyramide, the answer is no mortality benefit for everything except beta blockers. No mortality benefit for any of them. And maybe no one else but you is going to solve it because no one else has. Who could there be more wonderful than myself? Well, I think it is I. Oh, yes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these channels one by one. And you're going to learn them because, ready? Everybody who's had an MI and is going to die is waiting for you to develop a drug based on this. And everybody who's got congestive failure is waiting for you to develop a drug based on this because no one else has. And it's got to be a drug that fixes this cardiac conduction but doesn't cause arrhythmias. So let's look at these phases here. Now, the first thing is that the fast channel's open. The fast channel's open and the heart starts to become sharply more positive. The heart starts to become sharply more positive because of the influx of sodium into the cell. Next, the sodium channels close very quickly and all of a sudden the action potential starts to come down. It starts to come down. It starts to come down because the sodium channels close quickly. And now how come it doesn't stay flat? Because we still have potassiums leaving. We still have potassium leaving. We still have calciums leaving. And that's why it starts to become more negative. Now, phase one is that short, sharp dip down. That short, sharp dip down. Phase zero, it goes up. That's sodium's entering. Short, sharp dip down. Sodium stop entering, but potassiums are leaving. Because the positive thing is leaving, the interior becomes more negative. That's when it says slight repolarization. The slight dip down is because those sodium channels stop. How come it doesn't remain flat? Because potassiums are leaving. Now, phase two is the plateau. Phase zero, it pops up. Phase one, it starts to go down a little bit. Then it plateaus. The plateau is exclusively because of these calcium channels. Calcium channels open and calcium goes in. Calcium channels open and calcium goes in. Calcium is positive, calcium goes in, and it maintains the interior of the cell at a positive level. They're called L because they are long, they last for a long time. G, remember that G equals conductance, and the conductance of calcium is in. The conductance of calcium is in. That's why this maintains as a plateau. Now, the flow or conductance of potassium decreases a bit. Since the flow or conductance of potassium, is it normally out or in? Conductance of potassium is normally out of the cell. Now, in phase 2, calcium goes in. Calcium is positive. It maintains the interior positive. How come it doesn't become negative given the fact that potassium is leaving? Potassium is leaving, but calcium is going in. They balanced. Some of the potassium channels are closed off. That's why in the net you have just as much calcium going in as you have potassium leaving, and it stays constant. Now, the potassium continues to leave. Remember, efflux, ef means from, af is to, ef is from, efflux flows from flows, continues through the ungated channels because, why does it continue through the ungated channels? Because the concentration of potassium, is it greater in the cell or is it greater outside the cell? The concentration of potassium is greater in the cell. Since the concentration of potassium is greater in the cell, ungated channels means that it flows according to a concentration gradient. If the concentration is in the cell is greater, that means the potassium will flow out, it'll leave. It'll leave. Now, if we go back to those original slides, so look back for a second and remember the concentration outside the cell of potassium is relatively low. That's why if you suddenly raise that potassium level, if you suddenly raise the extracellular potassium level, all of a sudden what will happen is that since you have these concentration-dependent channels, potassium will not be able to leave the cell anymore. Potassium will go into the cell. Potassium leaving the cell, potassium, the positive leaving the cell, makes the interior of the cell more negative. That's how you keep the cell polarized. If you suddenly put a burst of potassium outside here and you have concentration dependent ungated channels, it shoves the potassium back into the cell and the cell becomes more positive. And a suddenly more positive cell will that depolarize, repolarize, or hyperpolarize. Depolarize means it becomes more positive. Repolarize, go back down to its normal negative minus 70 millivolts. Hyperpolarize becomes more negative than usual. If potassium is suddenly shoved into the cell will depolarize. In certain states of barbarous intent, execution is legal and practiced as a society tries to vent. The prisoner is convicted and the IV is stuck inside as he prepares for execution by lethal injection. How is the heart stopped on the prisoner? Potassium injection causes a depolarization of all the cells. potassium injection. Stops the heart. The prisoner undergoes potassium injection, and the heart stops. What is the mechanism? The mechanism is the sudden depolarization without the ability to repolarize of the myocytes of the heart. You stop the heart. Back to where we were here. Now, in these phases, remember, in phase 0, sudden inward flux of sodium. Phase 1, the inward flux of sodium stops, and the reason that it becomes a little negative again is because you continue to have potassium leaving the cell. You hit a plateau in phase 2 because the long, slow calcium channels open. Calcium goes into the cell, keeping the interior of the cell positive because calcium is a di-2-valent cation. Cation is a positive charge. The potassium channels slow down. And although potassium efflux continues to come out through these ungated channels, which are concentration dependent, it heats balance and steady state. Plateau is based on the fact that some of the potassium channels are shut off. Calcium continues to go into the cell, and potassiums continue to come out. But not as much potassium is coming out as was coming out before. Now, calcium channel antagonists, the medications, diltiazem, verapamil, nifedipine, amlodipine, felodipine, nitrendipine, nicardipine, nimodipine, nitrendipine, nicardipine, felodipine, amlodipine, nifedipine, nitrendipine. There are 9 currently approved ones of these calcium channel blockers. Will shorten that plateau because it stops the calcium going in. If you stop the calcium going in, the potassiums are still going to be going out. If you can't get the calciums in, the interior of the cell will become more negative or more positive. Calciums are positive. If they can't go in, the interior of the cell becomes more negative. Now, let's see. Phase 0, sudden influx of sodium makes it positive. Phase 1, those fast sodium channels shut off, but potassium continues to leave. It comes down. Next, calcium starts to go in. The calcium is a positive charge, goes in, maintains this positive. Then the calcium channels shut off. The calcium channels shut off. L means long. Since the calcium channels shut off, G means conductance. The conductance of calcium goes down. Since the calcium channels shut off and the potassiums are continuing to leave the cell starts to become negative. That's phase 3. The potassium channels open and the flow or conduction of potassium leaves the cell. Look, I've been saying the same thing in many different versions the whole way. Depolarization, or the action potential, starts out with the fact that the positively charged sodium goes into the cell, raising the charge inside the cell. Then it starts to come back down because the sodium channels shut off and potassiums continue to leave. When the potassiums, which are positive, leave, it comes back down to its normal negativity inside the cell because the positive potassium is leaving. Positive potassium is leaving, it becomes negative inside. All the positive, shiny, happy people left, nothing but grumpy, negative people inside. The only difference is in the heart, we want it to go slower, and the heart has an influx of calcium that's long to slow down the action potential to give the heart time for the blood to physically leave the ventricle, period. Phase 4 is the part in between depolarizations. The flux of potassium is high. All the channel, both those voltage gated and ungated, are open. Because of both the voltage and the ungated channels, potassium in the net is leaving the cell and maintaining it nice and constant. Now, the only difference is that in nodal tissue, there's no stable phase 4. The nodal tissue continues to depolarize and then it pops and never quite stays flat. That's the only difference.